Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and for the next few videos, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as a number of other conflicts and how they relate to this, taking us on a trip around time, around history, and around the world itself, trying to decide how past events may influence this. We've talked about the American and Afghani fallout from the Soviet-Afghani war, but what happened to the Soviet Union, the other side? Well, 10 years of being bogged down and trying to take control of the Afghani government, they fought almost exactly the same imperial war that we've been fighting for the last 20 years in Afghanistan, only at twice the speed and around 4 times the casualties per year. You know, and this was notoriously a clusterfuck for us, both in terms of perceived legitimacy of our government, trust in the government, military-industrial complex, etc. There's so many places in the world right now that have plenty of reason to view us as villains. And as we'll eventually talk about in this video, both Chinese and Russian propaganda take plenty of advantage of this. Western anti-United States, anti-imperialist propaganda seems to have a pretty big grain of truth to it sometimes. I mean, yes, it is being used as propaganda, but at the same time, if we didn't do this kind of shit, we wouldn't be making it so easy for them on messaging. They really would have to be making stuff up about us to make us look bad. And they don't really, and that's the sad part. This is part of what made Russian propaganda channels like Russia Today so odd. A lot of times they're mostly telling a truthful story, but in the most negative way they can, distorting the facts or omitting context wherever needed to make us into the typical scheming villain. Anyways, the Soviet Union was very spread thin by this. The 10-year engagement pretty much forced the economy to collapse, and a commonality that I've seen in Russian leadership over the last 100 years, and perhaps even longer, is that often in sort of pissing matches between imperialist forces, Russian leaders don't particularly seem to mind their economy going to such a place that their people are starving. It just doesn't necessarily seem to bother them. Maybe this can be seen a little bit more generously as a side effect of the harsh and cruel weather conditions and realities of living in the Russian lands. But you could also see it as pretty heartless too. So the collapse of the Soviet Union went on for too long. When people started starving in the streets, it's probably a good time to, reduce the military budget, quit engaging in foreign wars. They could have peacefully withdrawn from the rest of the world and focused on keeping their citizens alive. Had their economy not collapsed, the Soviet Union might have made it through the 1980s, just like China. It could have happened. But in part, because of Afghanistan and its 10-year quagmire, they would never come close to winning. When the change of powers happened in Soviet Russia became just Russia, the Soviet Union of the Soviet state of Ukraine became Ukraine in 1991, officially declaring its independence. As all of this is happening, and as the starting point for this independence, all of the people are starving and desperately poor. And this is in part because of sanctions. This is in part because of military, and because it seemed like the best way of winning the war smoothly, without a nuclear engagement, was to play economic uncle and keep raising the stakes in proxy wars and just shoveling excesses of money and weapons into both, while hitting them with sanctions, any opposition we could to overwhelm their economy. And then it worked. It took a long time, but it worked. And that doesn't mean that this strategy didn't have its own brand of civilian casualties. The strategy did help us avoid nuclear war, but it also created a large amount of human suffering in its own way. All of these new governments of Russia, Ukraine, all of them, they're all being formed in this new world of suffering. And what happened especially in Russia, I don't necessarily know whether or not this happened in Ukraine per se, but I assume similar things happen because you end up with a similar situation afterwards. But the Soviet Union distributed its ownership because this was the type of communism where the government owned everything, not the people. And they actually became communist for just a minute by literally giving the people the means of production through vouchers for a share of the state industry. Sounds great. But what happened? Well, it wasn't money, for one. Money was already massively devalued. And because of inflation, food is expensive. No one had the money to pay for it. So naturally, what most did with these vouchers was say, how can I trade this for money? How much money can I get? And that was the thing on the tips of every former Soviet's tongue as they started to be handed out. And the people who were just wealthy enough that they could still eat, they offered them pennies on the dollar, while they consolidated a massive amount of industrial power, especially in the energy sector. This formed the wealthy oligarchs that would eventually get into power, and this is largely because of the corrupt strings that allowed them to do such things as hold state auctions in which the doors were locked and only a single oligarch was allowed into the room. Only a single bid was ever taken. And with only that oligarch bidding on whatever was at bid, it suddenly became theirs at a rock bottom price. And in the early history of independent Ukraine, it had a similar oligarchy-powered flavor, which was highly corrupt. And, to the detriment of Ukrainian people. It just was not a good start for independence. And the Ukrainian people fucking hate it. They hate it to this day. And what remnants of it remain and largely kept the status quo from 91 into the 20-teens was that these oligarchs, a lot like the Russian oligarchs, were aligned very closely with the Russian state. Therefore, this was kind of like a nominal independence. Many were beginning to feel like Ukraine was becoming that puppet state of Soviet powers once again. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, then prime minister, was declared the winner of the presidential elections, which the Supreme Court of Ukraine later ruled had been largely rigged. The results caused a public outcry in the support of the opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko, who challenged the outcome. During the tumultuous months of the Orange Revolution, candidate Yushchenko became gravely ill and was soon found by multiple independent physician groups to have been poisoned by dioxin. Yushchenko strongly suspected Russian involvement in his poisoning. All of this eventually resulted in the peaceful Orange Revolution, which brought Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko to power, while casting Yanukovych in opposition. This is where Yanukovych's story makes a strange intersection with America by way of an Atwater-era Republican strategist named Paul Manafort. First officially started working with Yanukovych and his pro-Russian Party of Regions in 2006, acting as a political consultant helping to burnish the party's tarnished image after the Orange Revolution, for primary elections later in that year. Manafort molded Yanukovych and the other members of his party into a more presentable politicians, down to even advising them on their hair and clothes, according to a Washington Post report on Manafort's work in Ukraine. U.S. diplomats in the country sent a cable back to the State Department in 2006, observing that the Party of Regions was shifting from a haven for Donetsk mobsters and oligarchs into something more polished looking. With thanks to this assistance, Yanukovych returned to power in 2006 and was then re-elected in 2010. Manafort stuck with Yanukovych over the course of his tumultuous presidency, which included the jailing of his chief political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko, in 2011. Manafort, however, denied involvement in any of the actions taken during the revolution, such as the violent crackdown on protests. One of Manafort's firms also ran a lobbying effort in Washington to court better press coverage and more favorable public opinion for Yanukovych's administration during this time. But even after Yanukovych fled Ukraine following Euromaidan, Manafort continued to work as a political consultant for the party, helping it after it became the newly renamed opposition bloc in 2014 parliamentary elections. Over the course of Manafort's time in Ukraine, he allegedly made himself incredibly wealthy while flouting international tax and lobbying laws. Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Bureau found handwritten ledgers that showed $12.7 million in payments to Manafort from Yanukovych's Party of Regions from the period of 2007 to 2012. Manafort would then return to the US to provide similar services and expertise to the Trump campaign. Although, I feel like he didn't provide nearly as much advice on how Trump should wear his hair. Then again, his hair is pretty iconic. Anyways. What about all that ill-gotten money? Scrutiny brought against the Trump administration for corruption would see that all of the above crimes revealed when he was indicted in 2017, with charges claiming that Manafort had failed to disclose both his status as a foreign agent and his foreign bank accounts despite nearly a decade's worth of involvement in Ukrainian politics. Manafort was prosecuted in not one but two federal courts. In August 2018, he stood trial in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia and was convicted on 8 charges of tax and bank fraud. Manafort was next prosecuted on 10 other charges, but this effort ended a mistrial, with Manafort later admitting to his guilt. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, Manafort pled guilty to 2 charges of conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government and witness tampering, while agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors. Also, fun fact, the U.S. has frozen Yanukovych's U.S. assets by sanction and banned him from entering the country. Not like recently either, but enough about either of them. Let's talk about what took him down. The Maidan or Euromaidan protests started in November 2013 after President Yanukovych began moving away from an association agreement that had been in the works for the European Union, and instead chose to establish closer ties with the Russian Federation. However, members of parliament voted on the 22nd of February to remove the president and set an election for May 25th to select his replacement, a move described by Russia as a coup, and appears to be the reason that Vladimir Putin began preparations to annex Crimea later in the year. That March, Putin directed Russian troops and intelligence agents to disarm Ukrainian forces and take control of Crimea. Following the invasion and disarmament of Crimea, a controversial referendum was held in March of 2014, and the official result was that 97% wished to join with Russia, which is a suspiciously high number that has not been recognized by many international agencies at this point. However, I also haven't necessarily heard that this election was fraudulent quite in the same ways that the 2004 election of Yanukovych. Putin then annexed the country using the vote for legitimacy. In the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, armed men declaring themselves as local militia and supported by pro-Russian protesters seized government buildings, police stations in several cities, and held unrecognized status referendums similar to the ones being held in Crimea, but without the same overwhelming support for annexation that Crimea had shown. This insurgency was led by Russian emissaries Igor Girkin and Alexander Borodai, as well as militants from Russia, such as Arseny Pavlov. They proclaimed the self-styled Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic which have controlled about 1/3 of the oblasts in the last 8 years. Russian forces have fought as well as trained and supported these separatists, as they've held the same or similar front lines for the entirety of the engagement, which is equal parts civil war and proxy war. Ceasefires are agreed upon and violated, predominantly by the Russian-backed separatists, on a daily basis for years. These are the contested borderlands between Ukraine and Russia in the east, the same ones that were declared independent just before the beginning of the invasion. It was this particular invasion, which started in 2014, that Vladimir Putin declared victory in February of 2022, ordering military forces to enter the breakaway Ukrainian republics, calling this act a peacekeeping mission. He decided that he already had enough control of these 2 regions that he could declare them independent, even though it's not his country to be declaring things independent in. So there is an ignored 8-year invasion of Ukraine by Russia that happened all through the 2010s, and this was capped off with the declaration of independence of those 2 regions, following their cap. While our governments funded this proxy war, we heard little or nothing about it for 8 bloody years, until finally this disaster became far too big to ignore. And now the whole world has begun to pay attention. And finally, It's about fucking time. While we're paying attention, it's worth noting the similar invasion to that first invasion in Ukraine is also currently happening in the former Soviet state of Georgia. Just worth mentioning, I don't know a ton about it, except that it's both less violent, but also more directly being done by the Russian military. And before we get off on this topic in this particular period of time, there's an interesting parallel between the things we discovered in the Mueller report and the first invasion, in that a big part of the Russian propaganda effort on both on its own citizens, as well as Ukrainian citizens, although it wasn't ever very successful in Ukraine on that front for the last 8 to 10 years. But largely what they've been trying to do is push and amplify actual organic separatist movements. And the funny thing is that they were literally doing the same thing here while they were doing this in Ukraine. And the evidence of this was detailed in the Mueller report. Particularly the ones that I remember the most, although there were other states that were mentioned in the report in relation to this. Russian state-aligned actors did things ranging from pumping Calexit and Texit hashtags to organizing distant events on Facebook. Like, they make the page, start the event, they get real-world Americans to show up to these kind of AstroTurf protests. I'll say that again, we have evidence that Russian actors used Facebook to set up real-world American protests. And I feel like these are pretty interesting because there were people who wondered why the organizers never showed up to these things, and always said, oh, I have to be out of town at that moment. So Russians were effectively getting real US people who had their own good faith reasons for supporting state level succession, but amplifying their voices inorganically. And largely, this is the exact same playbook that they've been doing for the last decade in Donbass. Russian disinformation, Russia's relationship with the media, which I mentioned before, is truly fascinating and horrifying. It's really hard to say that Russian citizens trust any media within the country, because it's just the way that a sense of theirs lies on both sides, which is probably very familiar to my American audience. And so much of it is state-controlled, though with the frequency of state agents making prominent positions on cable media, or even the cable media taking their story directly from the state account of things, you could say this is also familiar to us. But in Russia, there is controlled opposition as well to state media, and both of them lie. So it just makes it really impossible for Russians to feel like they can get truth within the mainstream media. But those who do follow a narrative, those who do think that there's something on Russian news that's worth believing, and follow this narrative that has been presented by Russia, that there are Nazi groups in the Donbass. And we'll talk about this claim in a bit as we're talking about justification. But they've also heard that there are huge Russian separatist protests, and that these displaced Russian citizens just want to be a part of Russia again. This is just the Crimean playbook all over again. Except that in this case, they could never get the votes required to legitimize their annexation efforts.